Thank you, everybody, for that, and thank you, John, for that lovely introduction, and thank you for coming here today. By way of a short background, I am actually of Egyptian birth. I was born in Egypt in a lovely place called Alexandria, but I grew up in Sydney and returned to Egypt in my teenage years to undertake my bachelor's degree. So when I talk about Australian-Arab relations, it's not just part of my work, it also has a personal resonance for me, and of course I have a very personal interest in what's happening in the Arab world at the moment, particularly Egypt. I still have many friends there and most of my extended family there, so it's a personal interest for me to keep up with what's going on there. The Arab Spring, as it's known in the Western world, if you have been living under a rock for the past 18 months, is known in the Arab world as Al-Thawra, or the rebellion. So the Arab Spring, although we use it often, it's not really a term that I like to use. I prefer to use the rebellion or the revolution, because I think that terminology of rebellion and revolution speaks more to the hearts of the Arab people who were involved in these times. Began at the end of 2010 with the self-immolation of a Tunisian street vendor. The Tunisians successfully overthrew their long-standing ruler in 2011, and what followed was a wave of revolutionary protests across several countries in the Arab world. Now, rather than focus on what happened during the Arab Spring, I don't want to spend too much of the time today going through a timeline of what happened in the Arab Spring, but I do have some photos taken here during the Egyptian revolutions from Tahrir Square, which was the main square in which the revolutions occurred. And these were taken by a friend of mine who I went to university with, who actually lives on Tahrir Square. And you can see how massive the demonstrations were in Egypt at the time. So what I'm going to do today is take you on a bit of a journey, a time journey. We're going to do a bit of time travelling. So I want to start with looking at where are we now? Where is the Arab world now after the Arab Springs, a year on after the Arab Springs? And then I want to go back in time with you and look at how we got there. How did we get to that point? And then look at, moving forward to the future, where do we go from here? So hopefully you won't get too confused, and it'll be an enjoyable ride. So I want to start off by looking at what's happened since the Arab Spring or the Arab revolutions. It's important to note that the revolutions did not yield uniform outcomes throughout the Arab world, as you can see. We've had new governments installed, we've had protests and changes to government, and we still have major protests and minor protests across the 22 countries that make up the Arab League. Where the ruling regime has been overthrown, in Tunisia, Libya and Egypt, there's not necessarily been a smooth transition to new government. Tunisia, of course, has had probably the smoothest transition. The elections last October resulted in a coalition led by the Islamist party Ennahda. Ennahda has taken a fairly moderate platform, reforming laws that were restricting association, assembly, speech and political diversity, and they've refrained from seeking to base their new constitution on Sharia law. Libya's progress after the fall of the Gaddafi regime is challenged by both regional and tribal rivalries and the fact that foreign intervention played a pivotal role in the regime change. And what that does is actually compromise, or threatens to compromise, I should say, the legitimacy of any successive governments after that. Egypt held its first elections. Yes, over the past 2 days, and I've been watching with great interest. The country, since the fall of Mubarak, the country's been ruled by the military regime, the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, and the past year or so has seen a number of violent clashes between protesters and the military, often resulting in deadly confrontations. There were 13 candidates standing in the first round of the Egyptian elections, and you might say that the Egyptians are spoilt for choice, but that's hardly the case. Of the 13 candidates. I think Egyptian people are very wary that there is very little choice of a candidate who actually has the skills, the trustworthiness to lead Egypt into a new era. So of those 13 candidates, there's five standout candidates. Two of them, Mohamed Morsi and Abdul Mun'im Abul Futuh, have either current or past connections to the Muslim Brotherhood. Another two, one is Amr Moussa, who's the former foreign minister and the head of the Arab League, and Ahmed Shafiq, who's an Air Force general and the head of the Egyptian authority, are seen to be fulul, which is an Arabic term that's used to mean fragments of the old regime, because of their association with the Mubarak government. The fifth candidate who actually has a chance of moving forward, Hamdin Sabahi, is a socialist and a Nasserite. So for Egyptians who fear either the prospect of Islamist rule or a return to pre-revolution regime, Sabahi kind of represents, I've heard him called the best of the worst. So, you know, I think the Egyptian presidential elections make the Gilad Abbott thing look fairly tame. Moving on to Syria. Syria continues to be in turmoil, headed towards a civil war due to both internal fractions and also external pressure. It's become a pivotal centre for what's often called a regional Cold War between Saudi Arabia and Iran. The challenge to the Assad regime in Syria, which is Iran's key strategic partner, has significant regional implications. And Iranian leaders who seek to preserve that Assad regime have publicly downplayed the significance of the Syrian protest movement, while reportedly assisting Assad in his violent repression. But the internal opposition continues in Syria, and what happens there remains to be seen. In other countries where the revolutions have not yielded a complete regime change, mainly in the region's monarchies, the Arab Spring or the Arab revolutions spurred modest reforms. And that was because the leaders tried to quell discontent and calm the protests through political concessions to their people. In some cases, combined with political force and repression. So Bahrain is an example where Bahrain, backed by Saudi forces, have used lethal force against their protesters, but protests there continue. And the so-called Arab Spring is now well over a year old, although the revolution continues, as many people have said. And there's been a lot of analysis and a lot of crystal ball gazing. I love crystal ball gazing. You're never quite right with it, but a lot of people still do it, attempting to predict what might be the short, medium or long-term outcomes of the revolutions. And what's come out of these predictions is the fact that the situation is in fact highly unpredictable, and it's a constantly changing landscape. Attempted forecasts of what the Arab Spring or the Arab revolutions might yield and its relevance to Western foreign policy have pendulumed. They've pendulumed between highly optimistic predictions that this Arab Spring would bring forth widespread democracy to the Arab region and become a defining characteristic in shaping the contours of a new Middle East. Pendulumed from there to perhaps overly pessimistic predictions that the Arab Spring would fall into this regressive abyss of radical or extremist Islamism. And it's in fact quite difficult to find any middle ground. Analysts and political pundits commenting on the Arab Spring seem to be divided into two camps. There's that one camp who believe that the Arab Spring heralded a new Middle East, materialising from the ashes of repressive and authoritarian regimes and guided to democracy by a generation of media-savvy youth. And then there's the other camp, that believe that the Arab Spring was grossly overestimated and that it was not the spring of democratization, but of Islamism, and a demonstration that Islamism is the most powerful ideological and political force in the Arab world. So these two camps of democracy and light versus Islamism and dark, it's not new at all. And it is in fact reflective of a very familiar pattern of Western engagement with the Arab world. A familiar pattern that's mired in this traditional yet flawed model, which divides the Arab world very neatly into you're either pro-Iranian, therefore extremist, therefore against us, or you're moderate, Western friendly, therefore with us. And this kind of separation of the Middle East and of the Arab world into these two camps of extreme and moderate doesn't do justice to the Arab world, really. It doesn't take into account all the complexities of the Arab world, of Arab society, of Arab culture, of the place of Islam in Arab culture and society, of the place of minority, significant minority religions in the history of the Arab world, in the history and the evolution of the Arab world. To me, I think the most lingering and salient expression of this traditional model of Western Arab engagement is the expression that, that the revolution has been hijacked by Islamists. And so while it's true that in countries where the regime was toppled by revolutions, Islamist interest groups seized on that void and fashioned themselves as political parties to gain popular support. But I think we need to ask, where are these fears of the Arab world regressing into an abyss of Islamism founded, and why do we have this expression coming out? The fact is that it's not the first time that Islamists have in fact vied for and won popular support. Fawad Ajami, for example, notes that in response to the defeat of the 1967 war, the Naksa, Islamic fundamentalists made a very eloquent and very moving case, turning that defeat into an advantage and arguing that the Arabs had lost the war not because they were busy worshipping, but because they had lost their faith and their bearings. And disconnected from a deeply held system of beliefs, the Arabs proved to be a very easy prey to Israeli power. It's not unusual in times of crisis. What do? People turn to God. But Ajami's analysis is just one analysis of why Islamism spread throughout the Arab world. This is encapsulates some of the fears that Islamism has hijacked the revolutions. This is an Egyptian cartoon. You can see there in the first one, it's Mubarak saying me or prison, and in the second one, it's obviously a religious figure saying me or hell. Great choice. So looking at why and how Islamism spread throughout the Arab world, the evolution of Islamism, and I refer here to a book by S. Sayed called A Fundamental Fear, Eurocentrism and the Emergence of Islamism. And there are 5 main reasons in the literature why Islamism spread. And the first one was this failure of nationalist secular elites to meet the aspirations of the people, particularly after the 1967 war. The promise of pan-Arabism, the promise of Nasserism didn't meet the basic needs of the people. It didn't fulfill their economic, social and cultural aspirations. The second one is the politicisation of the mosque, as the mosque became the centre of political talk, and Islamism became the language of political contestation. The third one is this continuing domination of ruling elites in post-colonial states. So while power was given to civil structures, while we had new civil structures, the dominant power still remained with the ruling elites. And those people who were put into civil positions actually had a lot less power than they thought they might have. The fourth one is petrodollars, internal migration and the increased influence of conservative Arab governments, particularly Saudi Arabia, for example. And the fourth one is cultural erosion, integration, and a Muslim identity crisis. We hear a lot about Muslim identity crisis. You know, I'm Muslim. I don't know how many identity crises I can put up with anymore. But apparently I've had a lot. What we had then in this situation before the revolutions was a number of competing ideologies, where Islam or Islamism was presented and offered as a competing force to secularism and pan-Arabism. Pan-Arabism being this belief that Arab speakers of the Middle East would be best served if they were combined into one nation state, and Islamism, a shared religion, where shared religion is the basis of unity, and that the government should promote the Muslims' performance of their faith, and at the very least establish Sharia as the law of the state. And then secularism. And I remember after the fall of Mubarak, going on to looking at on social networking sites, some of the discussions that were coming up. And the biggest discussion was, should we be secular or should we be an Islamist nation? And people always take the two extremes. So those who were against an Islamist nation was going, no, we don't want to be Iran. And those who were saying, no, we're against secularism, they used to call it, saying, no, we don't want to be France. So they're taking France as the model of secularism and Iran as the model of an Islamic state. And of course, those two are two very extremes and two very different ways in which Islamism or secularism are manifest. So throughout the Arab world, you know, and I'm focusing here on this this fear almost, or this expression that the Arab revolutions will yield Islamism throughout the Arab world. But there are, in fact, the Arab world is not homogeneous. It's not homogeneous at all. We're very, very different. Egyptians are different from Lebanese, are different from Iraqi, are different from Libyan, are different from Yemeni. You know, sometimes we do tend to look at the Arab world as one huge monolith and not recognize those differences. And the way that Islamism manifests throughout the Arab world was also very different. In Lebanon, you had visible Islamism. In places like Albania, Islamism was there, but it was invisible. In Algeria and Egypt, you have enduring secularism among the elites. I'm often told I'm part of the problem because I'm one of those secular elites, having graduated from the American University in Cairo. In Jordan, you have secularism accommodating Islamism. In Pakistan, Islamism becomes the language of political contestation. The mosque becomes the place of contesting politics. And in Iran and Sudan, you had secularism completely replaced by Islamism. So let's look at the question here. What will be the role of Islam in Arab world politics after the Arab revolutions? So I want to just focus on some key points. The first point is that Islamist parties are genuinely popular in much of the Arab world. And they are popular because they represent an antithesis to the repressive, autocratic regimes who were often supported by Western governments while they continued to be repressive and autocratic. The second point is that elections are not going to be won on the basis of religion alone. We cannot underestimate the Arab people in this way. We cannot underestimate them in this way. And I'll give you an example. Some of the Islamist candidates in Egypt actually had lost a lot of support because they started to invoke piety as a barometer of their political capacity. So there was one of I think it was Morsi, who was, there were these posters of him praying, and in the streets people were saying, I don't want him to teach me how to pray. I want him to get me a job. I want him to make food affordable. I want him to give me some freedom of expression. I don't need him to teach me how to pray. So the elections are not going to be based on religion alone. And there's an example there. You've got the Islamists yelling, "No bikini!" and everybody else coming up with their issues: poverty, unemployment, housing, human rights, education, bread, healthcare, and healthcare prices. The third point that I want to make is that mobilization is no longer confined to the mosque. And that's a really important point, because that's going to be something that you can't go back on. It's now written into the hearts and the minds of the people in the Arab world that they can make change. And I find it very interesting that, you know, the language of political contestation was moved from the mosque to the internet to the streets throughout the Arab revolutions. You're never going to take that away from them. And I'll give you another example of that. I got an email today of one of my friends who's in Egypt for the elections, and he's participating in something called Shayfinkum. Shayfinkum means we see you. And this is a group of citizens, Egyptian people, who are watching over the elections. They're watching over the elections and reporting to it. So they're moving from polling booth to polling booth to polling booth, reporting to each other and stopping any kind of, you know, naughtiness that might be going on, any kind of corruption that might be going on. They didn't leave it up to the authorities. They took that power in their own hands. They have that agency now. And I think that's something that you will never take away from the Arab people after the revolutions. Finally, the final point that I want to make with regard to the role of Islam in a future Arab world is that it will manifest differently in different countries. We shouldn't assume that every country that comes under Islamist rule will become the next Iran. We need to consider that Islamism is not homogeneous and that it will be introduced in ways that have the capacity to accommodate and be integrated into new democratic systems. Despite what we might think, more Islam does not always mean less democracy. Apart from Saudi Arabia, many countries already apply a complicated mix of Sharia law and civil law. And if we even look at moderate Islamism, we see within it some fundamental principles, the principles of consultation, of consensus, of independent legal reasoning, that are actually very compliant with the very cornerstones of democracy. And if we look at the Muslim Brotherhood, for example, the evolution of the Muslim Brotherhood, I find it very interesting that the people of Egypt in a number of days did what dissident groups in Egypt and in other parts of the Arab world were trying to do for decades through violent means. In a number of days, they were able to topple a government. And I find it also very interesting that Ayman al-Zawahiri, who was Osama bin Laden's right-hand man in Al-Qaeda, has gone eerily silent about the revolutions because his goal was always to topple the Egyptian government. And through decades of using violent means, using dissident terrorism to do that, he was not able to do that. But the Egyptian people, regardless of their religion, regardless of their gender, regardless of their political affiliations, stood together and were able to do that in a number of days. It's very interesting, and I think something that is likely to have a lasting effect as well. But the Egyptian Brotherhood actually selectively filtered some major Western political doctrines like constitutional rule and democracy into a modernized Islamic concept of the state. Hence, within the Islamic world today, the demands of the mainstream Islamist movements in Algeria, in Tunisia, in Jordan, and in Egypt are based on Islamic State, constitutional rule, and multi-party politics. Not necessarily the image of an Islamist state that we might have. So through moderate Islamist political thought, it's possible to position pluralism and democracy as religious rights based on these Islamic principles and Islamic doctrines. And one example is the doctrine of shura, or consultation, that actually demands the participation of society in running the affairs of the government. Democracy, yes? In my thoughts, having an Islamist government in some of the Arab countries, by necessity, I think they will have an organic transformation. They will need to organically transform to be able to accommodate democracy and to be able to, if they can, base this on the principles of Islam that are by nature very democratic. One of the things that I said earlier was that it's important to note that the elections are not going to be won on religion alone. And part of that is because of the key players in the revolutions throughout all of the Arab world were not religious. Okay? The revolutions weren't about religion. Okay? They also weren't about anti-Westernism. They were about internal issues. They were about 60% of your wage being spent on food. They were about a majority youth who most were highly educated and couldn't find jobs. They were about 40 and 50% unemployment. They were about long bread lines. They were about police brutality. They were not about religion, and they were not about foreign policy. Okay? So I think it's important to remember that in projecting what might then be some of the long-term or medium-term impacts of the Arab revolutions. The thing I think we should remember is that the Arab people actually want democracy. They actually want their governments to deal with their issues, their internal issues, and I think that's going to bear on Arab foreign policy as well, and how active some Arab countries are going to be in foreign policy over the next decade or so. I found these two. These are views on free speech and democracy in the Arab world. And so you can see this one here, views on free speech. The question was, a constitution for a new country should include guarantees for free speech. Had 94% in Egypt, 90% in Indonesia, 92% in Iran, 88% in Turkey, and 97% in the US. So why should we presume that they want anything different from us? Again, this question here, democracy may have its problems, but it's better than any other form of government. The percentage agreeing, you can see Jordan over 70%, Palestine close to 80%, Algeria close to 70%, Morocco over 90%, Kuwait close to 90%, Lebanon over 80%, and Yemen over 60%. Just some interesting facts there. Okay, so to close off then, let's move on to where do we go from here? Where do we go? Oh, that's the big question. Let's do some crystal ball gazing, yeah? First thing I think that we need to do is we need to recognise and accept that Islamism may well be the preferred political model. May well be the preferred political model. And we need to accept that. But we need to recognise that within that there is this potential for the supporting of human rights, for the development of human rights and the development of democracy based on some principles of Islamism, on moderate Islamism. We need to be guided by the aspirations of the Arab people, not by our flawed assumptions, not by our traditional way of approaching the Arab world as either pro or anti, as either extremist or moderate. The Arab people have made it very clear what they want. We need to, in engaging the Arab world, be guided by those aspirations. We need new language and a different foreign policy approach, one that moves away from that traditional flawed pattern of engagement. And in doing that, we shouldn't be complacent in our assumptions about the Middle East or its politics. It is ever-changing. It is an uncertain landscape. And so we should take that into account as we engage with them. And we need to engage the emerging regional influentials. As countries that are installing new governments and new forms of democracy and working their way through this, as they do that, they're going to be much more internally focused. In other words, they're going to be looking into their own backyards, dealing with their own internal and domestic issues, and probably for the next decade or so, which means they may not be so active in foreign policy. And in that kind of situation, we have some new regional influentials rising. One of them is Qatar. It's got the highest GDP per capita in the Arab world, keen to diversify, it's got stable institutional frameworks and very efficient markets. And very keen also to engage Australia. The other one is Saudi Arabia. Probably the only major Arab country that's likely to actively engage diplomatically, mainly because of its enormous wealth, but also because its regime needs to have an active foreign policy in order to curb Iranian influence in the region. And it also has stable institutions. Egypt, the traditional leader of the Arab world, will probably remain fairly politically inverted for some time, with limited capacity to influence the region. The same goes for Iraq, which has traditionally been the other major centre of Arab power. The non-Arab powers in the region, i.e. Turkey, Iran and Israel, will be major regional players, and their actions and relationships are likely to impact on the region as well. So, to wrap up, and before I move on to questions from the audience, I just want to make a few more pertinent points in summing up this. First of all, it is a time of turbulent change and it is unpredictable. But what can we predict? What can we know? We can know that the power of the people will endure. It's difficult to go back once you have agency in the hearts and the minds of the people. We know that Islam will play a role. We know that. May not be a bad role. Okay, maybe a good role. And we can't assume that it's going to be a bad role. Okay, we need to engage with the idea that it may well be a good role. We need to move on from the old ways of looking at the Arab world. We need to find new platforms of engagement. We need to know that their internal concerns may also affect their foreign policy and the way that they engage. And we need to finally look at what are some of these platforms that we can use for engagement. Now, obviously, I'm in education, so I'm a big advocate of using education as a platform for engagement. Not just for cultural exchange, not just for the exchange of students coming to experience Australia or our students going there, but also as a springboard for trade. For the exchange of ideas and for capacity building. So not just matching business to business, but perhaps matching business to the kind of expertise, research expertise and technical expertise that universities are developing. I think we need to remember that, yeah, Australia is mostly desert. So is the Arab world. Okay? Our concerns are their concerns. Our priorities are their priorities. Food security, water security, you know, our industries are the same as their industries. So, you know, I've been very fortunate that I come from two cultures, because when you do come from two cultures, you often are put in a position where you have to overlook differences and find commonalities. And I think, you know, that's what we can do in engaging the Arab world, overlook some of those differences, find those commonalities. And our commonalities are very much in what are our priorities for the next 20, 30 years, environmental sustainability, as I said, water and food security, our environments, our climates are very similar to many countries in the Arab world as well. And with that, I think I will shut up for a change and throw to the audience for some questions and discussion. Thank you. You know, I find it hard to apply left and right to the Brotherhood because even within the Brotherhood there are factions. So it's a bit like, you know, any kind of political party, there are factions that are left or right. So, you know, in the Brotherhood, there's an internal fraction in there because you've got the young members of the Brotherhood who want to embrace this kind of moderate Islamism that accommodates democracy, whereas some of the more traditional members of the Brotherhood take a more traditional approach to that. And then you've got some members who are influenced by more Salafi leanings or Wahhabi leanings, and others who aren't so influenced by that. In terms of their rights,
yes.
You know, I think with you know, as I said at the beginning, I'm secular, so I'm secular, but I'm willing to entertain the idea that Islamism has the potential to be a vehicle for developing a kind of Arab democracy, not Western democracy, but a kind of Arab democracy that can work. So I'm secular, but I'm secular perhaps because I also hold some of these fears that wrong interpretations of Islam or thwarted interpretations of Islam will impact on women's rights, will impact on human rights in general, and will have a detrimental impact to that. So while I like the idea of an ideal kind of ideal Islamism that really is moderate, that really does use these fundamental principles of Islam to fashion itself in a way that is democratic and that is aware of human rights and sensitive to human rights, and that does not have detrimental impacts on women's rights, I'm wary of how that works in countries where there are cultural issues, there are perhaps they lack institutional capacity to deal with some of those issues, and where there might be a strong influence of the more extremist interpretations. So what about women's rights? I think women's rights are always going to come under the microscope in the Arab world. I don't like to compare women's rights over there to women's rights in other parts of the world because I don't think that really achieves anything. But I think that there are a lot of misconceptions that we have about the role of women in the Arab world that are often overlooked in terms of the kind of power and equality that Arab women have that sometimes our women don't have. So I'll give you a very quick example. On the weekend I was speaking to someone who's an engineer, and he's a professor of engineering, and he said that he's actually had some Iranian female engineering students go back to Iran because they found it so difficult to handle and to understand the male-dominated engineering groups that they were in. That they were very, very few women, whereas in Iran, he said, it was 50-50. And they found it very difficult to come to terms with that most of the engineering students were male and very few were female here in Australia. I think an Arab form of democracy is, it's hard for me to know what, I don't know what it will be. I don't know what it will be because I can't know exactly what it will be in reality. But theoretically, it could be a kind of democracy that is, takes into account the culture and the history of the Arab world, of many countries in the Arab world, that's either tribal or very family affiliated, it's not individualistic cultures there. It's very collective culture, a very collective way of doing things, and that draws on those principles of Islam. So there has a separate constitution that may or may not be based on Sharia law, but has draws on those concepts of Islam that are very democratic, that are particularly the concept of shura, which necessitates the active participation of society in the affairs of government. That's what I would see as an Arab form of democracy. Whether or not it's possible, it needs institutional change, it needs cultural change, it needs structural change for that to happen. Do you know, I always say something. I always say the best thing in Australia's favour at the moment is that we're not America. And you know, I've been to the Maldives, and they, you know, and they say the same thing. They say, "Oh, you're Australian, great. You're not American." So I think that's in our favour, and I think yes, Australia has enormous capacity. We have so much to offer, and there are so many opportunities for mutual benefit between us and the countries in the Arab world. Not only because we're not American, you know, let's not sell ourselves short. We do have, you know, not only because of that, there's more to us than just not being American. We do have, you know, those common platforms of engagement, the issues that we see as important to us for the next decade or so are also important to Arab countries for the next decade or so. And I think that's where Australia can make huge inroads in engaging with the Arab world. What would be the relationship between an Islamic government and Western countries? I think that depends on Western countries taking a different way of engaging with the Arab world, a way that is not completely dismissive of, or not dismissive, but that looks at Islamic governments as pro-Iranian extremist, or looks at them as you're either moderate or you're extremist, but engages with them on those principles of Islam that are very much like Western democratic principles. So what that relationship will be, I don't know, but it depends on us. Okay? Because we have to accept that that might be the case. It may not, but it might be the case. And if it is, then we have to change how we're going to work with that. So the question was about economic policy, and with high unemployment it requires a strong and robust economic policy to address those issues. I remember watching the revolutions on television, and the whole time I was thinking, you know, I really admire this is great, but getting rid of Mubarak is not going to put bread on your table, people, and I hope that you realise that. You know, you're sitting there at 1 a.m. talking to the television like a mad woman. And you're very right. And there's been a lot of debate about who has the capacity to develop this robust economic policy that's going to take the Arab countries, particularly Egypt, Tunisia, into the future. The high unemployment rates is also a factor of the demographics, with high numbers of youth and less immigration outside to the other Arab countries, to Qatar and Dubai and Saudi Arabia for those youth. I don't know much about economic policy, so I can't really answer that question, other than to say that yes, it is a huge issue, and yes, I think that among the people of Egypt there is a recognition that, first of all, democracy isn't just about voting. Okay, among most of the people there is that, and that I did say that among the 13 leaders there was a general consensus and feeling among the Egyptian people that not one of them had the skills and the knowledge and the trustworthiness to lead them into the future. And I think economic policy plays a big role in that. One of the things that you could look at is perhaps economic freedom. The Fraser Institute, along with Occupaid in Oman, does the Economic Freedom Index. And in places where there is significant economic freedom, there also seem to be a lot less unemployment and fewer issues around that. The question was about regional influentials, and particularly Qatar being a small country, how they might influence the region. I don't think they will, I think they are too small to influence the region, but I think they're influential in terms of being able to engage in foreign policy, actively engage in foreign policy. So influential in the foreign policy sense because they are, in a way, free, ready and able to. And willing to, because they want to diversify their economy. They're out there. We've got Qatar Airways coming to Perth, for example. You know, there's a huge interest in Australia among Qatar. They're looking at new ways of bringing in foreign investment and trade and vice versa. So in terms of regional influence, no. Not so much, because they are small. But in terms of being influentials for active external engagement, I think that's where the influential type thing lies, yeah? Never say never. You know, the Arab world, time is marked by war. So, you know, it's a volatile area. And yeah, you know, never say never, I think. I wouldn't like to say yes or no to that one. It is very unpredictable. I think they still have power simply because they have more money. And so I think that will be an enduring thing that we will see in Algeria and Egypt, that you will still have power vested within the secular elite. You know, that requires also a lot of cultural change, and perhaps over decades that might change. But I don't see that happening in the near future or short or even medium term. That's a good question, because a lot of people, you know, called it the Facebook revolution. Remember when it first started, everyone was calling it the Facebook revolution. Why now? You know, that was a good question, because when it happened, I think everyone went, oh my gosh. Look what's happening in the Arab world. Oh my gosh, these people actually have a voice. Oh wow, look, they actually want democracy. And it was such a shock. But if you had kept your eye on, and if you knew, you know, over the past decade or so, you could see it coming. We used to say, you know, every time I went to Egypt, I used to come back going, Muslim muwalla, it's on fire, it's on fire. We knew something was about to happen, something was going to erupt. It was just a matter of time. Why now, and did the technology have a part to play in it? You know, I think in Tunisia, of course, it was Mohammed al-Bouazizi who self-immolated, and that kind of triggered things. But in Egypt, for some time before the revolution in Egypt, you had a lot of Facebook activity around police brutality, exposing a lot of police brutality. And even before that, I remember, you know, being in Egypt in the 1990s, there's my age, 1990s, and you have a lot of political contestation in cartoons. You know, we used a lot of humour to make fun of the politics and to contest the politics. People weren't happy back then. You know, people were saying, "Yeah, I live from hand to mouth. I live from hand to mouth." So I think, why now? Why not now? Why didn't it come earlier? Is what I would ask.
Perhaps a bit of a tipping point, you know, the book.
Yes.
Things happen at a certain place, the right people are involved, the right technologies and stuff.
Yes, there is that whole tipping point. You know, what was it exactly that sparked it off? There's a, you know, that perhaps the Tunisian one caused a domino effect. But then I've read other analyses that says, you know, no, not necessarily. It wasn't necessarily a domino effect, because each one was born out of its own. Each one was born out of its own spring, if you want to say.
And you haven't asked the question about the technology. I want to know the answer, because I don't use Facebook, I don't feel left out.
Facebook, okay, yeah. Do you know, I find it really interesting, because you know, my internet drops out every 5 minutes. I don't know if yours is the same. My internet drops out every minute. But when I'm in Egypt, everywhere I go is Wi-Fi'd. Just about everywhere you go is Wi-Fi. There is an internet cafe on every street corner. And in fact, Arab youth have embraced social networking in far different ways than we have here, particularly in Australia. So social networking for Arab youth isn't just about, oh, I've got 1,000 friends on Facebook, as my son always says, I've got 1,000 friends on Facebook, and it's just not just about social interaction. It's about movement, it's about getting together, it's about sharing political ideas, it's about having a political forum, a forum for the sharing of political ideas. And so I think, did Facebook, I wouldn't call it the Facebook revolution. I wouldn't call it that, because there, you know, there are a lot of people who were mobilized not from Facebook. They were mobilized for reasons that were very personal and very entrenched in their everyday lives. But I think you need to look at how different Arab youth engage technology and engage social networking than we do. What did they use it for, and what do we use it for? Like I have on my Facebook, I've got friends who are in the Arab world, and I've got obviously friends in Australia. My friends in Australia will tell me what they had for dinner. My friends in the Arab world will tell me what's happening at the polls down the road, or, you know, or will post up pictures of police brutality. It's very, very different. It's quite interesting to watch the contrast. Yeah, I think so. I think there will be, or I hope there will be. I hope that the traditional structures allow for that. I hope that the structures and the institutional change to allow for youth to come out and become the next generation of leaders. But yeah, it is very interesting that they do post photos of themselves voting. When was the last time you posted a photo of yourself voting? Oh yeah, here I am, I'm going to go to the local school to vote. But you know, I hope that that's going to be the case. But whether or not the forms of engagement and political activism that the youth have found are going to allow them to transition to a kind of a formal type of political activism in terms of forming political parties, becoming political leaders, I think remains to be seen. You know, honestly, I really don't want to speak for the man on the street, because I'm not that person, but my perception, and from what I've been reading and looking at, I think that for the average Egyptian, now remember the average Egyptian, we're talking about the Sha'ab, high levels of low literacy or no literacy, and I think for them the vote itself, being able to go to a polling booth, being able to vote themselves is an empowering thing. And that, I think, to them brings with it the hope that all of those other issues, the bread and are going to be solved. And then you have another level of society which is debating these very economic issues and saying, you know, well, just giving us the vote doesn't give us democracy. We demand more. We demand more. You know, I think there's different perspectives on it depending on who you're talking about. You know, I read an article, and there was one woman who went to vote, and she was saying, you know, this is great, I'm able to vote, and, you know, I can't read, so I don't know who I voted for. But I voted, you know. And, you know, I think that's beautiful in a way, but, you know, in another way, I think there's other parts of the country, other people who are talking on other levels.